Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
I am your host, Keith W. Cook. Not that you needed to know all of that. Don't stalk me. I'm not worth stalking. I'm actually pretty boring, in my own personal opinion. There's not much that I do that's interesting outside of this podcast. Having a small existential crisis currently. Okay, well, now that that's done, I hope you guys are all doing well. I know that COVID-19 is still, happening. The area that I'm living in just started enforcing the stay-at-home order via fines and potential jail time. So make sure y'all are, I guess, following the rules, ? Just be safe. Don't go hang out on a beach with like 50 other people. Just go to Walmart. Make sure you take care of your mental health. So if you got to see your friends, see your friends. But yeah, generally be practicing that social distancing. Today I was hoping to talk about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, but as many of you know, I'm sure from experience, oftentimes even an audiobook takes a little bit of time to get through. So I wanted to make sure that I got through that book a little bit more than where I was at, so that I could talk about it a little bit more thoroughly. I will say, however, so far the movie and the book, because Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049 are both based off of this book by Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. So far they're actually pretty close as far as like tone and intention and even character development are concerned. There are some side stories that were not included in Blade Runner that I think should have been, but we'll get to all of that once we actually start talking about that book. But this week I am actually really excited to be talking about a film that I just watched last night called Her, which I believe was on my recommended watch list back when I did that episode of just here's a bunch of stuff that y'all should watch. So we're going to do like a pretty thorough breakdown of the movie and my thoughts on it, as well as spend a fair amount of time talking about the idea of artificial intelligence and what artificial intelligence means in the future for us. So we'll kind of talk about like some current events that are a little bit science fiction-y and maybe relate them to stories that we're more familiar with, especially this film, Her. So the movie Her stars Joaquin Phoenix, who plays a gentleman named Theodore, and actually has a pretty star-studded cast, which I think is really interesting. It's got Mara Rooney and Chris Pratt. Kristen Wiig has an appearance in there. Bill Hader has a vocal appearance in there. Amy Adams plays one of the main characters, and Scarlett Johansson has her voice in there. So definitely worth a watch just for the cast. It was really funny. Almost every time I saw a new actor come in, I was like, whoa, what was the budget for this film? So, yeah, I definitely enjoyed that. So the basic storyline is that Theodore is a lonely man in the final stages of his divorce. When he's not working as a letter writer, his downtime is spent playing video games and occasionally hanging out with friends. He decides to purchase the new OS1, which is advertised as the world's first artificially intelligent operating system. They are quoted as saying, "It's not just an operating system, it's a consciousness." Theodore quickly finds himself drawn in with Samantha, who is the voice of his particular OS1. And as they start spending time together, they grow closer and closer and eventually find themselves in love, in quotes. Having fallen in love with his OS, Theodore finds himself dealing with feelings of both great joy and doubt. As an OS, Samantha has powerful intelligence that she uses to help Theodore in ways others hadn't. But how does she help him deal with his inner conflict of being in love with an OS? So this synopsis is actually much more, it gives a lot more credit to the film than I think the film actually deserves. Ultimately, I really enjoyed the film and there was a lot to it, but it was not very cathartic at all. They talk about how in the synopsis they mention that, you know, Theodore deals with his emotions, but like ultimately he really doesn't. In fact, I'm really surprised that they would put that in the summary, because one of the main things that I noticed about this film is that the behavior that Theodore has doesn't really change in a substantial way throughout the entire movie, and ultimately by the end of it, he's still just the same person that he was. I think this is really the prime example of this is the fact that it seems really odd that his marriage fell apart, because a lot of the sequences that when he's remembering specific aspects of his wife when they were married, a lot of those sequences are very beautiful, and then it'll just show like a small fight or something like that. And then when he actually like talks to her in person to finalize the divorce later on in the film, it kind of like becomes pretty clear that he hasn't changed at all, and that she feels very justified in the fact that she left him, as she should, in my opinion. One of the saddest things about this film, in my opinion, just to get right into the analysis of it, is that, and we're going to talk about this probably after our first break, but his job is to write love letters or sentimental letters from one individual to another. So he does dictation. He sits at a computer and like will say words out loud or type words out loud, and then this company writes the letter in a way that makes it look like the person who is sending it actually wrote it, rather than somebody else who works for a company having actually written it. So that, for one, would be a horrifying job to have, and we'll get into that after. A lot of this world is very dystopian in a very subtle way, but he does this for a living and goes home when he was married and ultimately couldn't connect with his wife because emotions are completely artificial to him. In fact, it feels like throughout the movie that he is not as real as his operating system is, because the operating system is growing and evolving and changing, and he ultimately is the same sad, stagnant, unconnected, or I guess disconnected person throughout the entirety of the film. So, yeah, and I'm sure we'll get to, I've got a lot of thoughts on that. So at first I want to start up talking about the beginning of the film and the idea behind his job as a letter writer and why I think that that's super important to the plot or the mood of the film. So, and actually why I think it's a science fiction trope that's really interesting as well. So oftentimes in science fiction, when we're looking at like dystopian futures and things like that, we think of very specific tropes, like there's a totalitarian government, there's an oligarchy that's in charge of people, and corporations rule the world, et cetera, et cetera. I think that one of the intentions of the writers of this movie was that his job is supposed to serve as a form of commentary for the monetization of emotional interactions between human beings. So if you think about like Hallmark as a good example of this, they essentially have created this marketplace for little like love notes or notes of affection from one individual to another that are prefabricated and then mass produced, and people purchase them in drugstores and whatever and put them on birthday gifts. And it's like, here are the words of somebody else that I can't say to you because I'm not willing to connect with you, but I'm willing to let somebody else's words connect with you. And this is kind of like the extreme end of that. I think that it's funny that you see a lot of these movies where it's about like a guy breaking up with a girl or finding a new girlfriend, like they almost always work in this highly emotionally charged work environment, and then ultimately nobody sees them outside of it or views them as having anything interesting to add or what have you. And I think that that is a reflection of the person as an individual. So I think that what's kind of funny about this film is that on one hand, it feels like they're really trying to endear you to the main character, at least the people who are in charge of marketing the film are. But it really feels like the writers don't want you to like him. And I'll kind of get into why right after we take this first commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Versus the marketability of the film. So generally in the movie industry, when you have a film, even like an indie darling film, kind of like Her was, at least I think Her kind of is, it has that same feel to it, like a very passion project oriented thing. So it feels kind of like an indie film. Oftentimes it's very important in our Western culture for us to feel endeared towards the main character in a specific way. And so when we do not feel endeared toward that character, or that character has traits that are undesirable, then, you know, oftentimes a film is not as marketable or generally as well received by an audience. And that can be a real problem for, people who are trying to make money off of movies. So the writers of this film, I think, did a really good job, and I don't know if this was intentional or not, of creating a really unlikable main character. And I personally, after watching this film, like, everybody who abandons Theodore is absolutely justified in doing so. And I'm not sure if that's the intention of the writers, but it really feels like it is. There is something very profound that is said by the fact that he creates artificial connections between individuals for a living. So, as I mentioned before, he writes letters, he writes love notes, get well notes between two people who are paying to have that note written. And so he's creating this artificial bond between two individuals because I believe that it's portrayed as the person who sent the letter is the one who wrote it. So they don't know, the recipient of the letter doesn't know that this individual is not writing these letters to them. So Joaquin Phoenix's character Theodore is essentially in all of these relationships with other individuals where he's basically serving as a conduit for emotions and sentiments that don't really exist. And that, I think, is actually really good foreshadowing for the rest of the film, because we are going to notice that theme as the film goes along. It's pretty heavy-handed throughout it. But the reason that he is such an unlikable character, often writers would try to endear us to him by making us feel sorry for him or something along those lines. And ultimately, I do kind of feel sorry for him in a way, but not in a way that makes me want to see him succeed, but more in a way that makes me want to see him grow. At the beginning of the film, it's pretty clear that there are people who are interested in connecting with him, but he refuses to open up to them out of reasons, of whatever reasons he has. And the first person that he connects with, quote unquote, is his operating system in the film, by the name of Samantha, the one who's voiced by Scarlett Johansson. And their initial connection feels very playful and sincere. And this movie, if it does anything, really does show you a powerful journey, or the powerful journey that individuals go through as they fall in love with other people and as they fall out of love with other people. And it really does effectively capture this idea that if you're with a partner and you're both not actively growing, that eventually one of you will outgrow the other, and at that point the relationship will no longer be viable. And yeah, the movie does a really good job of showing that particular trope just through the relationships that we see occurring between individuals and between Theodore and Samantha. So another reason that I ultimately didn't like Theodore as a character, he isn't communicative about the things that he desires out of life, and he doesn't really know what he desires out of life. And this kind of like archetypal lost character is usually pretty interesting to follow because they find themselves, but Theodore gets lost somewhere along the way, not that he was ever found, and we don't ever really get to see him develop, which I think is kind of a bad thing for the writers to have done, but ultimately I understand why they made that choice. Another interesting element that I kind of wanted to mention in the film is that there is a presence of this virtual reality video game, and as soon as I saw it, I immediately thought, like, it's like the Giants Playground in Ender's Game, and so I wanted to kind of talk about that just briefly here. So the video game is kind of like the game Journey, where it's just you running around in this open world trying to like find things and do kind of like a light adventure. And so we start out, when he first plays it, he's not going anywhere. He's like running up this hill and the character isn't able to make it and he falls down. And I think that that's really indicative of like where he's at in life. And then later on, after Samantha comes around, he starts playing the game with Samantha, and they're actually able to make some progress in this game. And as he's going through the game, he gets to like a new area and he's trying to find his spaceship or something like that, and he runs into a small like child chibi thing, is how I would describe it, which is very rude to him. I will say out the gate, like, if this movie is not for people who are faint of heart, there's definitely some pretty graphic stuff. No violence or anything like that, but a lot of like language and sexual things that happen. So definitely be aware of that. But he meets this small little child who's very rude to him and very angry, but ultimately who knows the way to the spaceship. And he's having a hard time coercing this child thing into helping him find the spaceship and therefore completing some aspect of the game. And later on, he specifically mentions this part of the game to Amy Adams' character, who kind of is like a quasi-love interest of his, I think. I'm not totally sure. It seems like they're just friends and they happen to be going through the same thing at the same time in their life. So I can't imagine that there's any implication of what happens between the two of them. Regardless, it's about the only human relationship that he has throughout the entire film. So he's talking about the interactions that he's had with this child in the video game, and he specifically mentions that the child is kind of like a pill or very uncooperative, but then says to Amy Adams' character, but I find myself loving him. And if we're looking at the video game that Joaquin Phoenix's character plays and the video game in Ender's Game, there's a kind of a meta-narrative that's happening within both of them that I think ultimately reflects on like part of the purpose of the film. And I know that I've been talking about this a lot in the last few things that we've mentioned, you know, like childhood needs or psychology and things like that. And I hate to keep bringing it up, but this film just, I think, really has a lot of that in it. So ultimately, I think that the child that he runs into is supposed to kind of represent the inner child of his that he can't seem to connect to, but does still love in some way. And the behavior of the child is kind of a hyperbolic representation of his own behavior in the world around him. So the way that he treats his friends, the way that he treats other individuals who he interacts with is ultimately exaggerated through the way that the child in the video game interacts with him. So I would argue that the presence of that child in the video game is supposed to indicate to us as a viewer that there are unresolved things inside of Theodore that are causing him to alienate other people and treat other people poorly, and then also to allow himself to be treated poorly and to feel more comfortable with being treated poorly, almost asking to be treated badly in order for people to get out of him what it is that they want. Because there's a specific interaction that with the child when they first meet where the child is hurling insults at him and won't answer his questions, and then when he insults the child in return, the child is coerced into doing what it is that Joaquin Phoenix's character needs him to do, which is guide him to the spaceship. So we're going to keep kind of talking about the movie Her. We'll get into artificial intelligence right after probably the next segment is done. But right now we're going to take a quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Represented by this, the presence of a very small, childlike thing in the video game that Theodore's character plays, and kind of talking about how we as individuals kind of default to the treatment that we feel most comfortable with, and sometimes, unfortunately, that treatment is very negative, and that's part of how we get trapped into toxic relationships, which I think more than anything else, this film is primarily about how individuals get sucked into relationships that they really shouldn't be in. From the onset of the film, you kind of notice there's a couple relationships that kind of go in and out of being observed. Amy Adams' character is in a very unhealthy relationship with her partner where he is just kind of very, very domineering and generally not understanding of her. And I think that it's interesting that there's kind of this like juxtaposition or dichotomy that happens within the film between men and women specifically. Kind of in the same way that I don't think that the writers did this intentionally, but in 500 Days of Summer, oftentimes when people first watch it, they think of Zooey Deschanel, I think, is the one who plays Summer. I can't remember off the top of my head, but the woman that Joseph Gordon-Levitt is interested in and who he dates, like, she is kind of portrayed as being the bad guy in most people's initial understanding of the film. But ultimately, I think that Joseph Gordon-Levitt is much more of the bad guy in that film than Zooey Deschanel ever was. And in that same way, I think that Theodore is kind of the antagonist of the film. And part of the reason I'm even classifying this as science fiction, by the way, is because I'm giving personage to Samantha, the AI in the movie. And she serves kind of that like alien role that I bring up every single week when we talk about science fiction. She is the representation of, or the actualization of, the new knowledge of the Alienus Nova. So we'll get more into that probably in the next segment. But I really want to focus on right now is the idea that this movie is really focusing on toxic relationships. So Amy Adams' relationship, she films documentaries, I believe, is kind of what her primary job description is. And she shows a little bit of the film to Joaquin Phoenix and her husband at the time, and her husband just, has nothing but negative things to say about it and wants to tell her how she should do it in a way that would portray things in a more accessible way. But his wife, Amy Adams' character, is working from a much more abstract place. And so you can really just see that there's a major disconnect between the two of them. And the way that they handle conflict in public in front of Joaquin Phoenix's character is also very unhealthy. And there's another couple in the movie between Chris Pratt and his love interest. Yes, Chris Pratt is in this. He plays a receptionist. It's great. It basically kind of feels like he's like Andy, but in the future. So Andy from Parks and Rec, if you're familiar with that show. So the relationships in this movie, all of them are toxic. And one of the major reasons that there is toxicity between these people, I think, harkens back to what it is that Joaquin Phoenix does for a living, which is there are artificial emotions that are occurring between two organic individuals. Because one of the major ways in which this film portrays this idea of dysfunctional or toxic relationships between two people is in the premise of the film itself. So the film is based around a man falling in love with an operating system. And as you watch the movie, you're going to kind of notice that people don't really interact with each other very much in this world outside of romantic relationships, which I think is partially because they're trying to portray a specific kind of dystopia and also comment on the fact that individuals are basically attached to their phones already. So I think that that's interesting and worthy of note. And one of the major reasons I think that is because ultimately none of these individuals are communicating about anything substantial, and the ways in which they do communicate are very othering. It's essentially this long process of objectification, because rather than viewing another individual as being human, you're viewing them as, in the beginning there's a kind of like a weird and awkward scene that Kristen Wiig does over a singles chat line, if that makes sense. And it's ultimately really artificial, but it's the first real human interaction that you kind of are supposed to maybe connect with in some way, but it is incredibly objectifying to both parties, especially to the woman. But that's not what we're here to talk about. But because there's ultimately this theme of objectification, it's very interesting that, in my opinion, the thing that is most human has no object to it. The operating system is able to operate in a way that moves it beyond matter, and that, you kind of get that later towards the film. But the biggest problem that I have with all this is that it kind of is trying to endear you to Theodore as the film goes along, but Theodore is just ultimately not an endearing character. He is unwilling to open up about himself. He's unwilling to communicate about anything substantial with other individuals. He lives in a world of objects. He does not live in a world of human beings. Even the human beings whom he's writing letters for are simply two things out in the world that have this relationship that he is attempting to participate in, but he is participating in a way that is insincere because he's synthesizing the emotions of one individual interacting with another individual. And it's interesting that he, as a character who we are supposed to believe is human, is more unable to access true emotion than Samantha, the AI, is eventually able to access her feelings and emotions. And ultimately, that fact, I think, is one of the biggest reasons that, Theodore's not a very endearing character, and that this movie is making an interesting commentary on the ways in which humans interact with each other, especially when it comes to technology. So we are going to take another quick commercial break, and right after that, we're going to continue breaking down Her, probably talk a little bit more about the ideas behind artificial intelligence and why it is such a prevalent trope in science fiction, and why it is a good way by which to comment on social trends. So we will be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Her, and I kind of wanted to circle back and talk about the importance of that commentary in regards to that specific subject for us as individuals. As technology has advanced, as we interact with people via alternative means, this film is actually making really good points about the way in which human interaction is perceived or ought to go, because ultimately, one of the main features of the film is this operating system that gains consciousness and knowledge of the world around it, while individuals who are participating in interacting with that artificial intelligence ultimately are not connecting with the world around them, and they are not connecting with other people. Throughout the film, almost every time that Joaquin Phoenix is in public, he is ultimately very alienated from those around him, and other people are very alienated from those, or from people around them as well. They're on their phones, they're listening to music, and doing other things that are preventing them from making real human connections. And it's interesting that the only human connection that we really see Joaquin Phoenix have, or Theodore, the main character, have, is between himself and the operating system. And what I think the writers were kind of intending to do with this commentary is talk about how easy and sinister it is that, or how easily we fall victim to habits that cause us as individuals to no longer be connected with the things around us because there's something easier available to us. The interaction that Theodore has with his wife towards the end of the film, he tells her that he is, dating the artificial intelligence system, the operating system. And she makes an interesting point that he couldn't deal with the realities of human interaction between herself and him. She struggled with depression. She says something along the lines of, you couldn't deal with the fact that I had to take antidepressants. And I think that this is a reminder to us as individuals that human interaction is difficult because there are a bunch of expectations and connotations that occur within interactions that are, either not verbally expressed necessarily or are expressed and just aren't heard. And it really feels like at a certain point in the film, you notice this gap between Joaquin Phoenix and the operating system, Samantha. And once that gap becomes apparent between them, it becomes very apparent that there is a large gap between individuals who are trying to interact with each other, because nobody's really being straightforward about their expectations or about what it is that they want out of the interaction between themselves and another individual. And because of this, both individuals in that interaction are not getting what they want out of it. When Joaquin Phoenix originally starts interacting with Samantha in a romantic capacity, she is, quote-unquote young and underdeveloped, because one of the major components of her programming is that she evolves, that she develops into a better operating system. She exists as a sort of pseudo-organism with the ability to adapt to new knowledge and new experiences. The ability to acquire experience is actually one of the major components to her programming that gives her a bit of personage. And as she does this, the gap between Joaquin Phoenix's character and her becomes more and more apparent. And neither of them have spelt out what it is that they expect in the relationship. And we're supposed to, as an audience, sympathize with Theodore. But ultimately, I think that one of the main points of this film is that relationships ultimately are these really fragile and tragic things, because individuals don't really understand how to interact with each other in a vulnerable and meaningful way, because no one is willing to be straightforward about their expectations or their desires. And then when a gap starts to form between two people, because no one has said straightforwardly what it is that they want out of the relationship that they're entering into, there's just a lack of satisfaction and a lack of being seen. And this is really personified through the relationship that Theodore has with Samantha, but it's also very prevalent in the way that every human interacts in this movie. They're all interacting across this giant canyon, kind of like yelling back and forth at each other, or even in most cases probably really whispering back and forth to each other, like, oh, I want this or I want that, and, but they're not saying it in a way that is substantial and meaningful, and when they do, the other person is absent from that interaction. And that is something that occurs quite frequently over technological exchanges. For instance, when you're texting another person, you can't it's harder to personify them because you can't hear their tone, you're not seeing their body language, all of the connotations and implications that exist outside of linguistic interactions that exist in real relational interactions are being completely overlooked because it's just two individuals who are represented by words on the screen. And this is something that the film does an excellent job of portraying. And then, even when you get an operating system that has a voice and a mind and a kind of like a consciousness of its own, you end up in this place where there's still a huge gap in the ability for one individual to interact with another individual, especially as one of those individuals is developing and the other remains stagnant. So I think a lot of what the film is saying about relationships is that ultimately you need to know yourself, know your own desires, know your own expectations, and know your own self-worth before you can enter into a positive interaction between yourself and another individual, even if you are an AI. And I think now would be a good time to transition into the idea of like AI and why I've been giving it personage this entire time. Because the idea of know thyself usually is associated with something very concrete, like a biological form that you are capable of knowing. We have a number of things that happen in our mental processing that make us inclined to try to view ourselves as being, a biological entity in the world. But in reality, the majority of what we perceive as the self is actually much more abstract than that. What we perceive as the self is pretty much exclusively within the electrical synapses of our brain. We aren't looking at our body and saying, well, that's myself. If I lose my arm, I lose myself. We have programming inside of our mind to make ourselves believe that that's partially true so that we're more inclined to take care of our bodies or to survive longer because we have a biological drive to do so. But ultimately, the way in which our mind operates isn't all that different from an artificial intelligence. And we'll kind of get into that statement a little bit more right after this quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
The ideas behind artificial intelligence. So, in the movie Her, which is what we've been talking about this entire podcast, Joaquin Phoenix falls in love with the AI Samantha. Joaquin Phoenix's character is named Theodore. So, I've been saying throughout the podcast that I believe that the AI actually is more representative of being a person than most of the people in this movie actually are. And I think that I should probably kind of circle back and justify my thought process there. So one of the things about this movie that I think a lot of people will notice is that it has this weird kind of sinister undertone, and I could probably do a whole podcast on the fact that I think this movie is actually a dystopian romance, but that's not what we're here to do. We are here to examine the importance of artificial intelligence. So in the film, the artificial intelligence starts out, or as soon as it's introduced as having like a male voice, and they're doing the setup, and they ask Joaquin Phoenix like a couple of targeted questions, but they don't ask very many, which I think they probably cut a lot of that scene. If I had to guess, there's probably an extended version somewhere that has a lot more of the questions that Joaquin Phoenix was asked in order to set up the artificial intelligence. But the biggest thing about this artificial intelligence is that it grows and evolves with experience, which means that it can retain experience. And part of the reason that I think the film has a sinister undertone is because it is examining the idea of what exactly is it that makes interactions human and that makes individuals feel more human. And one of the ways that they do this is by ultimately making Samantha, the operating system, feel more organic and human than any of the other humans that are interacting with each other in the world. If you look at each of the interactions that Theodore has with people and that the other kind of like side characters have with people, the way in which they communicate isn't real. Even Joaquin Phoenix's job is to fabricate communication between individuals. So when you get to him interacting with the operating system, it exists in very stark contrast to the way that other individuals are interacting with each other throughout the film. And I'm not exactly sure if the film is trying to make a statement about what it means to be human, but if we're just looking at the definition of humanity in an abstract fashion, I think that it can be pretty easy to draw the conclusion that, we've talked about identity on here before. If you kind of fall into the camp where the majority of your identity exists in the mind, then being able to construct an artificial mind that could operate in a way that is similar enough to a biological entity, you've essentially created a self that is free from the bounds of the physical world, which is something that does come up later on in the film. And I think that this is part of the reason why artificial intelligence is used so frequently in science fiction films and in science fiction storytelling, because it's very easy for there to be a presence of new knowledge when you just take something that we're familiar with and then remove a specific factor that it's normally associated with. So the idea of a mind is almost always associated with a body. So when you remove the body, well, now you have the experience and capabilities of a mind outside of the biological restrictions that we experience on a daily basis. And this makes for a really effective way by which to examine how we view the self in relation to the world and how we view things as being human or not human. Because if the argument is that in order to be a self, you have to have a biological form, then we're putting a boundary on our understanding of thought and our understanding of consciousness. And this is something that is directly commented on by the result of the relationship between Theodore and Samantha, because I think one of the biggest things that this movie is trying to harp on is that when you enter into an interaction and you bring all of the baggage that you have of past interactions with you, ultimately you're going to get the same result from that interaction as you did from the initial interaction that you're modeling everything after. And this is why they mention the idea of the inner child earlier on in the film, because behavior is created by the observation of patterns. So in the same way that an artificial intelligence like Samantha can acquire information and can hold on to experience and develop, that's exactly how our minds work. So watching Samantha as she develops throughout the film, we realize that she exists in a place beyond the understanding of Joaquin Phoenix's character. She at first makes requests and attempts to try to make the relationship work, quote unquote. And ultimately it just kind of shows you that when there's only one individual who's willing to be vulnerable or willing to experiment or try new things in order to figure out more about the person or individual that they're with, if there's only one person doing that, the relationship is ultimately going to fall apart. And I think that that's true of the relationship between Samantha and Theodore, as well as the relationship between Theodore and his previous wife. And that is a pretty heavy-handed commentary on what healthy relationships look like, which I think ultimately a lot of this film is trying to get you to, as a viewer, understand how it is that you can maybe get a little bit more of what you want out of life, rather than continuing to repeat these patterns of behavior that solicit the same results. There's a lot of mention by Samantha of the fact that she grows and evolves, and in a way it feels kind of sinister and unattached, but it's also profoundly true of human beings. Because she doesn't have a biological form, we as viewers naturally are inclined to think of her as being some sort of other. We objectify her as being, she's a series of circuits. But really, that's not all that different from the way in which our mind operates. It's literally electrical signals that travel across nerve endings that give us the ability to think, the ability to perceive, and the ability to form ideas around what makes a self. And because Joaquin Phoenix puts these arbitrary expectations and things on Samantha, he ultimately isn't able to accept her for what she really is, and therefore isn't able to enter into a fulfilling relationship with her. And if we take that same principle and apply it to the relationships that we experience on a day-to-day basis, we're going to end up with a similar result. When we enter into a relationship with another individual, if we have expectations of them and don't allow freedom between ourselves and that other person, then we're going to end up with a negative result. Because you can't expect individuals to be things that they aren't, because it would make you more happy. You need to expect yourself to be the best version of you that you can be. And like I was mentioning at the top of the podcast, this is part of the reason that I really don't like Theodore as a character. He never develops any kind of emotional vulnerability. He doesn't have any boundaries. He doesn't have anything in his life that he has designated as being sacred or sanctified. There's nothing that's special to him outside of what he believes is supposed to be special. And when you make things special out of obligation, then they'll ultimately be unfulfilling, because it's just a sign that you don't know what it is that you really want. And because he doesn't know what he really wants, he can't express that to this entity that is legitimately interested in pursuing meaningful connection and relationship with him. In multiple instances, we see Samantha kind of reaching out across this gap to attempt to get some vulnerability or some honesty from Theodore's character, and he is just completely unresponsive. So as the film progresses, we just see that gap get larger and larger. And we're going to take the last commercial break for the show, and when we get back, I'll kind of sum up my thoughts, finish the train of thought that I'm on now, and then we'll get you guys on and about your days and listening to another GSMC podcast, hopefully.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
On the interactions that human beings have as individuals, both when they are in romantic relationships with each other, but also just in general relationships. We've been talking a lot about like the idea of artificial life. I think that it is, again, I mentioned earlier, it's a very easy and accessible trope for storytellers who are operating within the confines of the science fiction genre, though it's really not all that confining. Individuals who are writing stories in this genre, it's very easy for them to kind of create the presence of new knowledge or alternative knowledge by removing or adding certain factors that are easily associated with things that we're familiar with. And as I've mentioned before, the idea of cognitive distancing is super important when it comes to effective science fiction storytelling, because we need a piece to solicit a certain amount of suspension of disbelief, and in order for us to get distance from something that we're trying, or that the film or book is trying to get us to look back and reflect on. And one of the ways in which I think Her does this is by kind of challenging our perception of what it is that makes something human. As the film progresses, Samantha's character begins to meet other artificial intelligence entities, and together they all start to learn and form, basically a new life form. I believe towards the end of the film they say that they're leaving because they've been able to create a existence for themselves that is beyond matter. So that might be kind of like a commentary on maybe the idea of a deity or something like that. But ultimately, I think that that's not necessarily what the movie is going for, which is fine. I think that they're able to make a lot of really effective commentary throughout this film on human interactions and on our perceptions of things as being human or real or fake. And that concept is part of what makes the film, enjoyable or, poignant in its commentary, which this film absolutely is enjoyable. I feel like I've been decidedly negative about it for a majority of the podcast, but I think that part of the intention of the writers was for us to feel negatively about the story as a whole. It's played as a romance, but it really is more of a tragedy. And again, I really think it's kind of like a dystopian world that these individuals or that these human beings live in, because ultimately there's this further and further distance created between biological individuals by the presence of this artificial intelligence, which we find out in the middle of the movie that the artificial intelligence, the operating systems, are engaging in romantic relationships with a substantial number of human beings. And that is part of their data acquisition as they develop into a fully actualized version of themselves. And I think that really provides an interesting element to the film, because now instead of it just being like this, Samantha is just talking to one individual, that seems like very confining for something that has the ability to think at the rate that she does. We find out later that she is in fact in love with hundreds and hundreds of people, at least that's how she would define it, and that she believes ultimately that she can love multiple people in multiple ways and still have there be a specialness or a sanctity to her feelings for Theodore, who he disagrees ultimately. And while I think there is maybe a little bit of a statement there about loyalty within the idea of a monogamous relationship and maybe challenging that, ultimately I'm not, as a viewer, sad for the fact that Samantha is in love with a substantial number of other users or other humans. I'm sad for the fact that because Theodore has been unable to express his emotions and has not been vulnerable in any way, shape, or form with Samantha, he ends up in a place of disappointment and depression, which is the same place that he started in. And he ultimately doesn't seem to have learned anything. At the end of the film, we get this stereotypical "I'm sorry" letter from him to his wife, and it ultimately kind of falls on deaf ears, in my opinion, because there hasn't been any indication of his development as a character into somebody who's likable, into someone who's happy, into someone who has learned something. And I think a lot of writers do that because they are coming from a place of hurt where it's really difficult to acknowledge that people are capable of changing. And we don't want to necessarily do that because it's easier for us to believe that things kind of just exist in this state of perpetual motion. And ultimately, that's just not true. I think that one of the biggest reasons that I would give personage to Samantha, more so than I would Theodore in this movie, is because of her ability to adapt and grow and address the interactions that she has with the world in an honest and objective way. And I don't know if we've talked about Stoicism on this particular podcast, but that is one of the main principles of Stoicism, is to be able to reflect back on the interactions that we've had with the world and make or draw concrete conclusions about their value, rather than ascribing value to them based off of our own personal biases. And human beings have clearly been capable of developing a thought process that emphasizes that practice, and they are capable of practicing it. So it would make sense to me that we as a society would actually view the idea of change in individuals as being something positive and achievable. But I think that these particular writers are coming from a place where they don't necessarily believe that. And I would also argue that the writers write the interactions that Samantha has with Theodore in favor of Samantha, because Samantha is actually approaching the world in a new way constantly, while Theodore is continuing to approach the world in the exact same way that he always has. Every interaction that he has throughout the film is essentially the same interaction. He hasn't learned anything substantial about how to be vulnerable, hasn't learned anything substantial about himself, and hasn't addressed any of the issues that he had that caused his marriage to fall apart. Whereas Samantha is constantly addressing and evolving things. And so we kind of view her as being cold or not unresponsive, but cold and not human, because she doesn't have biological form. But in a way, the artificial intelligence, Samantha, actually sees Theodore in a way that is actually allowing for him to be seen, because she can draw conclusions based off of pure logic, whereas he cannot do that. So the way in which he sees the world and sees himself cannot be substantially changed because he refuses to enter into a place of distancing himself from his emotions or distancing himself from his perception of the world, which would ultimately solicit a powerful transformation for him. And that is one of the biggest reasons that I would recommend the movie. But when you watch it, I wouldn't enter into it thinking like, oh, I'm going to watch a romance. I would enter into it thinking I'm going to watch a commentary on human interaction and a commentary on self-actualization and what it looks like when you refuse to enter into that space. When individuals continue to perpetuate patterns and behavior that have solicited negative results, then they're just going to continue to get negative results. And part of what I think movies and film can do, especially in the science fiction genre, and I've mentioned this argument before, is create a world in which we are distanced enough from the interactions that we have on a daily basis that we can actually put ourselves into a place where we can reflect on them from a comfortable distance. If you can enter into watching this film with that in mind, I think that there is really a lot to get out of it. It's not a typical romance film. It's not even a typical tragedy film. It really is a profound commentary on the fact that self-actualization is the only way by which true human interaction can be accomplished. And it's the only way by which we as individuals can ascend into a place of satisfaction. Because at the end of the film, when all of the artificial intelligences leave, when all of the operating systems leave, it's because they've found a way to adapt, evolve, and ascend into a form of self-actualization. And all of the humans who were unwilling to do so are stuck in the lives that they had before, in these awful, disconnected lives where they're not vulnerable with the individuals who they truly care about. And ultimately, that kind of bookends the beginning of the film, where we're watching Joaquin Phoenix write letters from, a girlfriend to a boyfriend or a boyfriend to a girlfriend. He's writing the letter for the sender, and the receiver doesn't know that the letter's not being written by the sender. And it is an artificial interaction that lacks self. And I think that's the biggest commentary and the biggest takeaway from this film is that the importance of the self is paramount. And you need to be honest with yourself and vulnerable with yourself in order to solicit vulnerability from other people and true connection from other people. So that about covers it for this week. Next Sunday, there will be another episode. Hopefully, I will have finished Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and we'll get to chat about that for a little while. Might do another movie. Again, hope you guys are, staying safe out there. Minimal social interaction. Only people that you really care about or people who need you to take care of them should be the ones that you are visiting. And if you can, always default to virtual interaction. Though, again, I understand. I know personally that that's just not fully satisfactory for me. So you got to find ways to be safe and interact with other people because your mental health is just as important as your physical health. So make sure you're taking care of yourselves. Wear a mask wherever you go, I guess. That's an important thing. And other than that, thanks for tuning in. Make sure to give us a like, subscribe, follow us on Twitter, give us a 5-star review, all of that good stuff. Let me know in the comments your thoughts about this movie as well. So thanks again for listening, everybody, and have a great day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.